What in the world is an anacrusis? Welcome to the Tik-A Tee Method. My name is Ron Castonguay, and if you stick around for this video for week 34, you're going to find out exactly what a musical anacrusis is all about. Let's not waste any time. Let's get started. All right, here we are on the first page of week 34, and let's not waste any time. An anacrusis is a fancy name for a pickup measure. Let's read this first paragraph together. A pickup measure, also known as an anacrusis, is an incomplete measure that begins a song or a phrase. Pickup measures can occur in any time signature and can be any fragmented length of a measure in that given time signature. For example, in common time, a pickup measure could be as short as a single 16th note or as long as a dotted half note. As long as it's a fragmented, not a full measure, then it would be considered a pickup measure if it's at the start of a song or the beginning of a phrase. And as it says here, highlighted in yellow, understanding the length of a pickup measure is crucial to beginning a piece with rhythmic accuracy. And of course, that's what this book is all about. Now, let's read this last paragraph because it's pretty important. If there is a pickup measure, the final measure of the piece will often be shortened or truncated by the duration of the pickup measure itself. However, for our sight reading purposes here, and since these are only rhythmic exercises with no melodic or harmonic content, unless you add it because you're thinking outside the box, we will not abide by this general rule for the following examples and exercises. Let's instead focus on the pickup measure itself to be sure we understand how they work. So in older music, classical music, folk music, things of that nature, oftentimes the length of the pickup measure, the anacrusis, will be truncated from the last measure of that song or melody or phrase. And like I say here in this paragraph, we're not going to do that in our exercises for week 34. All right, now let's see what's going on at the bottom part of this page. The three pairs of examples below are rhythmically identical, with one small notation difference. Line 2 of each pair uses rests in the first measure instead of a pickup measure like in line 1. Ultimately, it is up to the composer and/or the publisher on how a pickup measure will be notated and published. So let's check out these three pairs of examples. Okay, let's look at the first pair of examples right here. And I'm actually going to look at line 2 first because this is just 4 measures in common time. And as we can see in the first measure, we have 3 beats of rest with that quarter note coming in on beat 4. And then the remainder of it, the remaining 3 measures are very, very simple. I'll just put the beats above just real quickly so that you can see where they fall. Nothing crazy here. We've got a tie going in, so I'm going to put this in parentheses since we're not going to re-articulate that half note. That'll take up beats 1 and 2, and then we've got beats 3 and 4 here with a -1 at the end. A very quick analysis of that second exercise. And if I was to count it off, 1, 2, here it is, rest, 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 ta, 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 ti, ti. Ti, ti, ta, ticka, ticka, ta, ta. Very straightforward, just 4 measures. Now, let's check out this one that has it written as a pickup measure with that quarter note that came in on beat 4 of line 2. Let's check out line 1. And remember, line 1 is rhythmically identical to line 2. The only difference is the notation. In measure 1 of line 2, we have a half rest and then a quarter rest. But if you look at line 1 right here, we just see a quarter note. Now that's the quarter note that came in on beat 4 of line number 2. The only difference is we remove the rests. So this is how you recognize a pickup measure or an anacrusis in your music. It's at the very beginning of the song or the melody or the phrase, and it's a fragmented measure. One quarter note does not fill up a measure in common time in 4/4. That's how we recognize that that first measure is not only fragmented, but we can classify it an anacrusis or a pickup measure. Now, how would we count this off? Well, actually, instead of counting off a full 4 beats like I did for line 2 and then coming in with rests, a count off for this exercise for line 1 would just be 3 beats, and then the musician would come in on beat 4, like this. 1, 2, 3. Ta, 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 tee, tee. Tee, tee, ta, ticka, ticka, ta, ta. If it was conducted, obviously you wouldn't get the snapping and you wouldn't get the 1, 2, 3 vocalized out loud. A conductor may give this. Ta, ta, or some cue like that, depending on the level of the ensemble the conductor is conducting. I know that if I'm conducting students, I'm actually going to conduct and mouth the first 3 beats like this. 1, 2, 3. Ta, making it very obvious. If you're in a professional ensemble, you may only get the prep beat to take a breath so that you can all come in together on that phrase like this. Ta, ta, so forth and so on. So it just depends on the ensemble. The point here is to be able to recognize a fragmented measure at the beginning of a piece of music classified or labeled as an anacrusis or a pickup measure. If you can do that, you can start the song rhythmically accurately. Okay, let's look at the second pair of examples right here. This one's a little bit trickier, but not too crazy. Again, I'm going to look at line 2 first. I'll just put the beats above the measures. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. You'll notice now we've got a half rest, a quarter rest, and then an eighth rest. We don't come in, we don't enter until the and of 4 or the upbeat of beat 4 right here on this eighth note. So that will come into play when we look at line 1. Then we have beats 1, 2, 3, 4 as this eighth rest. These 16th notes will come in on the upbeat of beat 4. Then we have T, ticka, rest. We have weak 6's rhythm here on beats 3 and 4. That dotted quarter note to eighth note almost become infamous. Then we have 1, 2, and 3, 4 with a cutoff on 1. Again, none of the rhythms in this line 2 are crazy. It's all common time, all rhythms we've done. Let me demonstrate these rhythms for you. 1, 2, ready, and T, 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 ta, ta, Tik-A Tee, Tik-A, ta, T, ta, T, T, ta. And again, state the obvious, these are not rhythms that are unfamiliar to us if we've gone through the book by now, right? Pretty simple. So how does line 1 differ from line 2? Line 2 is full 4 measures, no anacrusis or pickup. Line 1 is the one with the anacrusis. So here we can see we've got just that eighth note. It's a fragmented measure in common time. And if you have just a single eighth note, we as musicians / mathematicians have to know that that's going to be the upbeat of beat 4. The last eighth note before a bar line is indeed the and of or the upbeat of beat 4. And we have to know that rhythmically in order to start this piece correctly. So what would a conductor give us if we were in an ensemble and we had just the and of 4 here, the upbeat of 4? Well, again, if I'm conducting a student ensemble, I'll just vocalize it out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. T, T, okay, or whatever the first rhythm might be. But you heard me come in on that and of 4. Now, if I'm in a concert, T, T. All right, professional ensemble, T, T. It just depends on the level and what the musicians in the ensemble need from the conductor. But again, as musicians, we need to be able to see that in line 1 of this example, it's an anacrusis because it's a fragmented measure, so we've got a pickup. So let me demonstrate line 1, even though the rhythms are identical to line 2. Here's the count off. 1, 2, 3, Tee, 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 ta, ta. Tik-A tee, tik-A. Ta, tee, ta, tee, tee, ta. So you can hear how ultimately the rhythms for line 1 and line 2 in this pair of examples are identical, but the notation is so different that the melody actually has a different feel to it. It's important to note that the use of an anacrusis by a composer can definitely affect how a melody is received by an audience and performed by a musician. Now that's for another conversation in composition, for example, but an anacrusis is an often used tool in order to present a melody according to the way the composer wants it presented. Very important. And moving to this last pair of examples right here, let's continue in the same manner. I'm going to analyze line 2 first. We've got a half rest here on beats 1 and 2. Then we have T, 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 T. Then we've got a dotted quarter note here on beat 1 of measure 2. We can think of the dot as beat 2, and these 2 16th notes will come in on the upbeat of beat 2. On beats 3 and 4, I can bracket this because this is week 10's rhythmic sight word. Ti, ta, ti, that cool 8th note syncopation. In measure 3, we've got a quarter note, a quarter rest, an 8th rest. I'll make that 3 a little better. Then we've got this 8th note coming in on the upbeat of beat 3. Then we've got a quarter note on beat 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a -1, so that represents us holding that whole note full value. Let's hear what line 2 sounds like. 1, 2, here it is. Rest, rest. T, 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 ta. Tik-A tee, ta, T, ta. T, ta, ta. Holding that last note full value. So the rhythms on this one are pretty fun, but very simple, common time rhythms across the board. So we have to now talk about line 1 and how the anacrusis affects this rhythm. And honestly, the anacrusis is not going to affect the rhythm per se, but if we had a melody here, the feel would be different because we'd be starting in line 2, for example, with a half rest and then coming in on beat 3. As opposed to line 1, where we can see right here, we've just got 4 8th notes. And again, being the musicians / mathematicians that we are, we know that if we see a fragmented measure in common time with 4 8th notes, that first 8th note is going to come in on beat 3. So a count off in this example would be 1, 2, T, 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 boom. And that would be the first beat of the full measure. I hope that makes sense. And as I stated for the previous pairs of examples, the count off for line 1 in the third pair of examples with this anacrusis coming in on a beat 3 would just depend on what your musicians needed. If I was in a rehearsal of students, I would just say it out loud. 1, 2. T, 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 they would know very obviously. If it's a beginning ensemble, I might even give a measure in front. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. T, 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 T. All right? Now, if I'm in a concert with those students, I'm probably just going to conduct the first 2 beats in common time and mouth 1, 2, like this. T, 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 T. If I'm in a professional ensemble, I would probably just give a beat 3 and 4, a little prep beat, and they would know to come in on my downbeat. T, 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 boom. All right, and again, that's that first full measure after the anacrusis or pickup measure. Now, let's see what line 1 sounds like with an invisible mouthed 1, 2 as my count off. T, 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 ta, Tik-A tee, ta, T, ta, T, ta, ta. And you'll notice I removed the snapping and I just conducted, but you can still feel the tempo. The idea here is that you as musicians, and the whole concept of week 34, is to start to recognize when you have an anacrusis, when you have a pickup measure. And the way to do that is look at the time signature and make sure that first measure of the song, of the melody, is a full measure in that time signature. Because if it's not, if it's any fragmented version of that time signature, you now, my friends, have an anacrusis. All right, since we just did 3 examples of an anacrusis in 4/4 time, in common time, let's go find an exercise from week 34 that's not in common time. Let's go. All right, I found a fun one here. This is exercise 34G, and as you can see, we are in 6/8 here. And if you look at this very first measure, and you're thinking about the math of 6/8, which is 6/8 notes or 2 dotted quarter notes, or however you want to break it down, once you break this down, you will see that we've only got 4 out of the 6/8 notes in that very first measure. Therefore, what do we have? We have an anacrusis, or a pickup measure. And this one is fun because, as I say in the last little sentence right here, we actually have a pickup to a pickup. And I'll show you what I mean by that as we analyze the exercise. Let's first read the little note here at the top. The MP3 count-off will be 1, 2, 1. And as you're thinking of that 1, 2, 1, you're thinking T, 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 1, 2, 1. So stay tuned for more on that subdivision here in 6/8. Be sure to enter on the 3rd eighth note of the first beat in 6/8. Remember, the dotted quarter note's going to be getting the beat here. Our tempo is dotted quarter note equals 52 to 62. And check out this hint. Think of the 8th note pickup, this one right here, that I just underlined. Think of the 8th note pickup entrance as a pickup into beat 2. I call this a pickup to a pickup. So let's talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. Let's first imagine that this 8th note right here wasn't part of the anacrusis, wasn't part of the pickup measure. So all we had was this dotted 8th, 16th, 8th note rhythm. T-A-Tee, T-A-Tee, T-A-Tee. What beat in 6/8 would that rhythmic sight word come in on? Well, because you've done so much from the book already, you know that that's going to come in, and it's kind of sloppy here, so I'll bold it. That's going to come in on beat 2. So 1, T-A-Tee, 1, T-A-Tee. So imagine that we didn't have that 8th note that I circled, and that was just our pickup, and our count-off was still 1, 2, 1. 1, 2, 1. T-A-Tee, ta. That's how the piece would start. Now, let's erase all of this and perform it as it's written, thinking about this 8th note now. How do we put that 8th note in the correct spot, in the correct location? The way that I think of it is, it's an 8th note pickup into beat 2. So it's a pickup into a pickup. It would sound like this. 1, 2, 1, T-T-A-Tee, ta. I'll do that again. 1, 2, 1, T-T-A-Tee, ta. So you can hear how I'm coming in on that 3rd eighth note. T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-A-Tee, ta. I'll do that again. T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-A-Tee, ta. So it's pretty cool. So I'm thinking of it, if I drew arrows, I'm thinking of it like this, that this 8th note is a pickup into beat 2, and this overall is a pickup into the first full measure. Kind of cool, kind of advanced, but this is the kind of math musicians need to know. All right, so now that we've sort of figured out this anacrusis and we've analyzed it and we know how we're going to enter, let's just quickly analyze the rest of the exercise rhythmically. So we have beat 1 right here. We've got beat 2 starting right here because remember, this is going to be beat 1. This is going to be beat 2. All right, so we've got those 2 8th notes finishing off beat 2 in the first full measure of the exercise. That's what I would call it. The anacrusis is actually not measure 1. The first full measure I would categorize as measure 1. So going into the measure 2 here, we have ta-tee, a very simple, a very common rhythm in 6/8. Then we've got the T-A-Tee on beat 2. I'll put an invisible bar line right here. If I was back in measure 1, I'd put one right here. Going on to measure 3, the last measure on the first line. Again, invisible bar lines right here. Beat 1 is here, beat 2 is here. While we're holding that dotted quarter note, we can look ahead to line 2. Beat 1, invisible bar line. Beat 2, all right? The next measure, beat 1, invisible bar line. This is cool now. We've got a tuplet, tuplet. So here we are subdividing in 6/8. T, 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 T. Then all of a sudden we have T, 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 tuplet. All right, and that's how we're going to say that. That's actually called a duplet. We say tuplet in the Tik-A Tee method. And if you go back to the previous chapter that talked all about tuplets and quadruplets and duplets, you can learn more about that. Going into the second to last measure, we've got a dotted quarter note, the beat note in our case here for 6/8. Then we're going to put the invisible bar line here, then that T rhythm, that really cool 6/8 rhythmic sight word. Then we've got a dotted half note, taking up beats 1 and 2, writing -1, so we hold that full value. Okay, so we've analyzed this rhythmically. Hopefully that wasn't too fast because you've already done some analysis in 6/8, and these rhythms are rhythms that we've all gone over in the book. So exercise 34 is really just about analyzing and understanding, grasping the concept of the pickup measure, the anacrusis, okay? So I'm going to move forward here. Let's perform exercise 34G. I'm just going to use the snapping of my fingers as opposed to just setting up a metronome so that you can hear what that count off would sound like, and we'll stay pretty consistent. I might, however, be faster than the suggested tempo just so that you guys can hear the rhythm here, okay? But I suggest you do it along with me. Here we go. I'm going to erase the ink here just so we can clear that, so we can see it a little more clearly. I'm going to give us a 1, 2, 1. Here we go. 1, 2, 1. T-T-A-Tee-Ta. T-T-Ta, T-T-A-Tee-Ta, T-Ta, T-T-T, T-T-T-T, tuplet, ta, T-A-Tee-Ta. There it is. So that anacrusis measure, let me do just the anacrusis into the first beat of the first full measure one more time so you can hear it. 1, 2, 1, T-T-A-Tee-Ta. That's a really cool anacrusis or pickup measure, and I hope it makes sense to you. Now, we know that once we've vocalized a rhythmic exercise and we've sight read it, we need to know if we did it correctly. And the way you do that is by going to my website, finding the MP3 quote-unquote answer for exercise 34G. So let's go find that right now. All right, here we are, my friends, at my website where you can find, of course, all 363 of the MP3 quote-unquote answers that accompany the exercises in my book. Now, once you navigate to this page, and I'll put the website up at the top here so you can get there more quickly, you have to find the exercise. So here we are on week 34, and if you scroll up and down, you can see all these different weeks, and week 34 is going to be released next. You use these fast forward buttons right down here to get to exercise G. So let's just do that right now so we can get to exercise 34G. I'm going to press play on this in a minute. Now, you've already hopefully vocalized it with me once, but when you go and you check your answers, you've got a couple of different options here. You can just listen to the MP3 and check your work that way. You can sing along or vocalize along with the MP3, which I strongly suggest. And if you've already done that and you've got the MP3 up, you can break out your instrument and play along with the MP3, especially if your instrument is not primarily the voice. So without further ado, here is exercise 34G. One, two, one. T-T-A-Tee-Ta. T-T-Ta, T-T-A-Tee-Ta, T-Ta, T-T-T, T-T-T-T, tuplet, ta, T-A-Tee-Ta. And there it is. So you can hear that the tempo of the MP3 is actually a little more accommodating to the actual tempo that's written. The suggested tempo of dotted quarter note equals 52 to 62. Okay, so there's your answer, your MP3 for 34G. And if you have not yet played this exercise on your instrument, you need to do that before moving on. 1, 2, 1. All All right, that does it for week 34. If you want to do more practice exercises in common time, in 3/4, in 6/8, and even in cut time, all exercises that have pickup measures, the Anacrusis, then you've got to go out and get my book, Rhythmic Sight-Reading, the Tik-A Tee Method. It's available at my website, roncastonguay.com. It's also available on Amazon and at J.W. Pepper. And in the meantime, if you found this video helpful, please help out the channel, the TikATeeMethod, Method, by hitting that like and subscribe button and that notification bell so you get the latest video. Now, for week 35, for the next video, I'm going to be talking all about song mapping. So it's not about rhythms per se, but song mapping is really important when we sight read. So stay tuned for week 35. I hope you're going to join me for that video. Thank you for joining me today, and I will see you next time.